Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ed Stafford again for Anatolian Dispatch, an episode of a podcast sponsored by Aval News, your best source of information on all things Turkish. We focus on Turkey's foreign relations from the perspective of English speakers who have an abiding interest in Turkey. One of whom is with us today. This is retired Colonel Richard Outzen, who has been to Turkey many times. Next time we have him, we're going to have him chat up with us in Turkish a little bit. He can put me through the ringer because I have probably forgotten everything I ever learned. For those of you who did not catch an earlier episode with Rich, he's been to Turkey a number of times. He was working there for a while with former Ambassador Jim Jeffrey on the Syria-Turkish relations account, and he is now back in Washington. He's no longer part of the U.S. government, which is why we are able to hear his wisdom and knowledge. For many of you, you know that if we were still with the U.S. government, we would be gagged. So,
maybe bound.
Rich, how are you today?
Thanks, Ed. It's good to be with you again, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with an old friend and with someone who shares that abiding interest that you talked about. So, thanks for having me.
Well, we do get feedback from time to time from people, so we actually got a lot of very positive feedback the last time you were with us, which is why I was really hoping to get you back again. It's a good way to start June. Here we are coming into the summer months. We'll see what that holds for both the United States and Turkey, but I wanted you to speak a little bit, if you could. Maybe we could exchange some different thoughts on the visit of Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman. She was making kind of a grand tour. She went to Brussels for some NATO meetings, but then she went to Turkey, both to Ankara for official meetings, and then Istanbul, where she called on the Ecumenical Patriarch, Bartholomew. And now she's off to Cambodia, and then I think Indonesia, and that wraps up her visit. So I haven't seen a lot of reporting about how things went in Turkey. If you want to comment on that, or I mean, Deputy Secretary of State is a pretty high level person, and you would think it would have garnered a lot of attention.
It is odd to have someone relatively senior and a very respected diplomat, and Wendy Sherman, go and not have it make a lot of waves in the press. I may be wrong, but I think that the last time we had something that big or bigger was when we were working through the Operation Peace Spring issues in the fall of 2019. I remember that because I was on the trip with Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo, National Security Advisor O'Brien, and my boss at the time, Ambassador Jeffrey. And that was not under terribly auspicious circumstances. Of course, that was during the sort of mutual struggle over what was going to happen in Northeast Syria, right, with the timing being during the Operation Peace Spring that the Turks had. That was a lot of firepower to throw at a very urgent problem. But since that time, it's been fairly low key. I mean, there's been not a lot of phone calls. Obviously, the phone call there about when President Biden let President Erdogan know that he was going to be mentioning the word genocide in his discussions of April 24th and the Armenian massacres, or if you prefer the term genocide. Again, not terribly auspicious occasion, but in some ways, in this particular bilateral relationship, at least over the last decade or two, no news is good news. And to a certain extent, when there's not an imbroglio that comes about or a misstep, we can search for the outlines of something maybe positive. And that's how I'm interpreting this. And as you've rightly pointed out, I wasn't on the trip. I'm not in the State Department or in the government anymore, but I have spoken to some people in Turkey and some people who watch Turkey very closely. And here's what I think is going on. Here's where I think we're at. The outgoing Trump administration, which obviously has some detractors, including those in the current administration, did the current administration a favor. They did the favor in December of 2020 by imposing sanctions under the CAATSA Act, that's Combating America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which was designed back in 2017, I guess, or 2018, to punish essentially Russia by imposing secondary sanctions on countries that made major defense purchases from Russia. And the Turks, of course, had been working on this S-400 deal. So as the Trump administration went out the door, they were faced with the question of whether to do what they had been accused of doing anyway, which was to be soft on Turkey, or to impose something on the way out that might set up the incoming administration for success. I would argue that they chose the latter. By choosing some sanctions that were sort of on the lighter end of the scale, but by imposing something, they left the door open for the new administration coming in, if it wanted to tighten the screw a little bit, or if it wanted to leave room for effective transactional diplomacy. So I think this is Act Two to that. I think that Wendy Sherman going was, and has been interpreted in Ankara as laying down some ground rules for moving forward. Clearly, this administration is not, they're not Turkophilic, right? They're not coming in wanting to build on a legacy of good feeling and goodwill from, they are managing what both sides realize is currently a problematic relationship. What I think they did with the S-400 is they said some version of the following: look, we can't lift the cats of sanctions we've imposed, but we will not impose new sanctions if you obey the following or comply with the following red lines of ours. And I think one of those red lines was no Russians in Ankara working on the system. Why do I think that? I think that because Ragip Soylu, who's I think known to both of us, covered that story this morning, that in fact the Turkish government has come out now and said that Russian technicians for the system will only be working in and from Russia, and that it will be entirely a Turkish operation in terms of operating the system. I think there was probably a second part to that said no new major purchases. No, don't buy a second regiment.
Right.
And there might have been more. But so I think this was what Wendy Sherman's task was to lay down some ground rules for what the Biden administration wants to keep as an effective transactional relationship. In other words, do no harm, don't worsen things, but don't try to fix it, because it's probably not fixable just now. Now, the Turks in some other days and some other times might have pushed harder on some of their long-standing grievances about the Fethullah Gulen movement and Gulen's residence in Pennsylvania, about U.S. support to the YPG, and about this most recent declaration on the Armenian genocide. So why did they not do that? Because this is a time of great economic fragility for them, and I think both sides know that. If I can just add one more thing to that, this is U.S. diplomacy being effective and being smart. There are some people who think that big theatrical is the way to go when you want to make a point with a recalcitrant partner, or a partner with whom we're having some difficulties. Turks in the elite and popular sort of commentariat, they understand that the United States is first and foremost an economic power. Yes, we have military pressure, and yes, we have diplomatic weight, but neither of those gives us a veto on what Turkey does. But the economics is a unique form of leverage that we have. And I think the Turks get that.
Sorry about that. My apologies to everyone. Please go on.
Not at all. I think the dogs were providing approbation and sort of deep agreement, with what I was laying down there. Anyway, so what does this mean? It means that Wendy Sherman didn't go to fix the relationship, and we shouldn't expect that what she did is going to provide a silver bullet to fix S-400 or the other. But I think what she did is an important act of continuity, as I read the outlines of it from afar, in that she said, we understand that things have been bad, but we have a window for good, effective transactional, and that's what we want to sustain.
Okay, let me pick up. I think all that makes perfect sense. Wendy Sherman is an accomplished diplomat. I mean, she's been around the block. She knows, I'm sure she knew going out there, she wasn't going to fix everything. I do want you to comment, though, on one other element just before she went. And my understanding was that Ankara and Istanbul were not on the original itinerary that she had. That the original itinerary was go to NATO, do all the sort of stuff that she had to do there. Then it was becoming the East Asia Pacific visit. It was the visit to Cambodia, and it was the visit to Indonesia, and which Indonesia being the most important aspect of that visit. In part, it was a response, and I'd really like your opinion on this, to the statement that came. We had a little combat of podium speak. When the events were going on between Israel and Hamas at Gaza, President Erdogan made a statement that essentially said President Biden had blood on his hands. Then Ned Price, the State Department spokesman, I think it's worth noting, not the White House spokesperson, but the State Department spokesperson, came out with a statement that essentially called Erdogan anti-Semitic. And I really think there was a danger there for a moment that we were going to get into diplomacy from the podiums, which is a disaster. No matter, I don't care which school of diplomacy you come from, having senior officials or spokespersons of senior officials arguing in public against each other and going in veiled terms, of course, that nobody does this out. It's veiled terms, calling them names. It's not helpful to anyone or any relations. But do you think that part of what her job was to kind of say, okay, guys, let's not do this. That's, in a sense, let's not fight in front of the children, as it's sometimes referred to.
No, I think that's a good inference to make it, and I think what I was calling the diplomatic Heisman, the big hand pushing off, is essentially what happened for the first 3 months of the administration. So they came into office January 20th, 21st. I guess the 21st would have been the first day at work.
Yeah.
Through to February to March to April. That's 3 months with no senior level contact. Now we have a very competent ambassador in David Satterfield out there, and I think he's done a fantastic job. But people know that, especially when you're a carryover ambassador from the previous administration, that you may or may not have the ear of the seniors in the new administration. And there was crickets, silence in terms of senior level contacts. I think Cullen and O'Sullivan had a call or two, but when the president, neither the president nor the vice president has a senior level conversation in the first 3 months, it's a sign of problems. And this is not a relationship that benefits from drift. There's not a good sort of inertia or inertial momentum to it. So I think this wasn't a reading of the Riot Act to Ankara by any means, but I think it was a recognition that we need to, let's talk, because this is headed in a bad direction rhetorically.
Yeah.
And having a senior, because the Turks afford and accord great respect to senior level diplomats. They like the regular traffic of senior officials coming in, and this was a way to calm that down.
Right. One thing I would note, and this goes back to your point about, in many ways, no news is good news. Today, from the press office of the State Department, was released your kind of your standard anodyne press release about Wendy Sherman's visit in Cambodia. She met with this person, blah, blah, blah. There has been nothing about her visit to Turkey. At the same time, there's been nothing from the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs about it. Now, as well as I do, Turks are very protocol conscious. Wendy Sherman, we understand her rank and her access and her importance in U.S. foreign policy. But for many Turks, Deputy Secretary of State doesn't have the same cachet that Secretary of State would, or Vice President. So I think it might, I don't think it's a big deal that this did not get a press release from the State Department about her conversations and her meetings and all that sort of stuff.
I would agree with that. And I think in the age of digital diplomacy in which we live, sometimes the formal statements say far less than, for instance, a tweet. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Deputy Foreign Minister O'Neill did put out a statement, not a formal statement, but a tweeted statement on social media accounts saying that they appreciated the visit and it was a cordial exchange.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
And
I think
you're right about the social media having much more weight in this day and age.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it wasn't silence, and it wasn't, a broad statement of everything is great, but at the same time, it was clearly moving away from this hostility that was really being expressed from the podiums earlier. So, but let's move on to something else. One of the things that has concerned me is there's a lot of, you mentioned the fragility of the Turkish economy, which is clear. In a conversation I had last week with a Canadian friend, which is on Anatolian Dispatch, one of the things that we raised was the issue of how resilient Turkey has been. If you look over the last 30 years, and there have been a number of crises, economic crises, financial crises, that Turkey has faced. And yet, if I'm reading the numbers right, they're still somewhere in the 16th, 17th, 18th largest economy in the world.
Yeah, they're still in the G20. Yep.
Yeah.
And they had this tremendous growth in the first decade of the AKP government, where there was a tripling in real terms of per capita GDP. Things stagnated after that, but it's still a dynamic economy, and they're making some money off of things they didn't used to make money off of, like defense exports. They're an increasing player in energy, transport, and exploration. They've got some problems in terms of financial flows and imbalances and over-reliance on hot money and foreign debt and things like that. But, all in all, the reports of their death have been greatly exaggerated, to paraphrase an old wit. I think that if I had $1 or $10 for every time the Turkish economy had been predicted to crash in the last 10 years, I'll at least have a couple $100. I think that the main problem, so Turkey's it's a diversified economy.
Right.
It's its own small continent. They have agriculture, they have industry, they have a domestic market of 80 million. And they have robust trade relationships. And when they do suffer, when they get punched in the nose because there's a devaluation or a hiccup, which has happened, in the late 90s and at least once in the 2000s, what happens is their exports get cheaper, their people suffer because they can't buy as many imports. But Turks have an amazingly resilient society. This has been noticed from, just to take one example, at the extreme end of our time spectrum here, during the Korean War, prisoners of war held by the North Koreans and the Chinese, of all the nationalities, the ones who persisted and survived the most in captivity were the Turks, because when they got sick, their bonds of collegiality and commitment to one another didn't break down. Western societies, the French, the Brits, the Americans, the other soldiers under the UN banner that were fighting had a much higher mortality rate.
Yeah.
And I think the common interpretation given to that is that we're much more individualistic. We will suffer in pain on our own, and we'll offer help in extremis, but it's not as natural to us. Whereas you've seen among the Turks, I mean, they're in each other's business all the time, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's bad. But they share the suffering. That is true. And this is the second point I'll say on that, is that this is a society in which rationing of bread and meat is within living memory. They had in the late 1970s, in a much weaker economy before all of the privatization. And, we're talking about people, so my wife's age, for instance, that was a kid waiting in line for meat at these things. And so the younger generation, maybe that doesn't make as much of an impression, but I just think that Turkey is not one of those societies that, even when there's a severe economic dislocation, has the sort of social ruptures that you'd see elsewhere. Now, will they punish a government that's perceived as economically mismanaged? Yes, they will. And that's been demonstrated. And I think that's probably Erdogan's concern. But people who are expecting massive dislocations because of the economic pressure, first of all, misunderstand the diversity built into the Turkish market and how vulnerable they are. They are vulnerable, but it's certain sectors that are vulnerable, and they're survivable. And they're kind of jumping the gun, because this is all going to play out in the upcoming elections. And we're about 2 years out from those elections now.
Right.
And I think right now the polling shows there is a perception of that this vulnerability is at least in part a result of mismanagement. And that, I think, is reflected in the polling.
Well, I mean, look, we like to talk about economic issues, but I actually do believe that the better phrase to use is bread and butter issues, because it is the people sitting around, the dining room table with each other. It's the families sitting there having their breakfast with each other, having, what's the price of simit today? What is the price? How much are we spending for coffee and all this? That is, and they can read all the punditry, they can watch all the television news, but the truth of the matter is, if their sense, as President Ronald Reagan would ask, is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And if the answer is no, I'm worse off, every country in the world, if they have the chance, which they do in Turkey, they will punish the politicians, they will punish the incumbents. But it's just, that's how it works. And I think, as this plays out for Erdogan, it's going to be really tough, because I do think he's also getting some of the blame for the response to COVID. Although it's difficult, it's almost unfair in some ways, because which country really handled in the initial stages, in say the first 3 to 6 months, the response to the COVID pandemic? I can't think of one that really handled it well.
Yeah.
Missteps, misunderstandings, good intentions gone bad, this sort of stuff, which a novel virus is gonna lead to, I think.
Yeah, Turkey, by the way, is an interesting case study with regards to COVID, because there were some clear missteps there in terms of, for instance, availability of vaccines and the reliance on the Sinovac. They were slow to field the vaccines, and their case numbers were pretty bad. I mean, if you look at cases per million of population, Turkey was not where you would want to be. But in terms of fatalities per million, which is hard to fake, they were pretty darn good, because at the end of the day, they have a hybrid medical system. There are private providers and private insurance, but there's also a strong public option. They also have these public health clinics, the sağlık ocakları, that are available in just about every small town. And they had contact tracing that was very aggressive, and people going out. And so I think in some ways the response was adequate, and obviously it's still touch and go. There's been big damage to their summer tourist season, but the numbers, like in the rest of Europe, are coming down now. So they're hoping to revive some of that.
I had a number of discussions with different people when this was breaking out in the United States, and I'm like, okay, guys, we can focus on the case number, but we might want to focus on the fatality rate. Yeah. Because, yes, I understand that if people are not, if too many people are getting sick, it's going to stress the healthcare delivery system, and therefore you're going to actually have a higher fatality rate. But what you just pointed out was also the case in a number of other countries. If you had a well-developed hybrid healthcare system that could be nimble and respond, then you could do something. And, there are always going to be naysayers. I mean, all this is not to say that the government of Turkey got it right, nor did the United States, but that I think it goes to the point that it's going to be the economy that is going to be the question for Erdogan in 2023. And whoever his chief rival is, which is, one of those to be determined things. Yeah. I really do. I don't think the issues about Turkish involvement in Libya, Turkish involvement in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Eastern Mediterranean issues with Greece and other countries, I don't think those are going to be major issues in 2023 election. I think it's going to be the economy. And we'll see how much the resilience, because, particularly under Turgut Özal, but other, the whole privatization, a lot of people still have a misperception of the Turkish economy. It is a robust and diverse economy, as you mentioned. I think people don't understand how diverse it is.
That's right. I mean, and obviously agriculture and tourism are important sectors that they're a little vulnerable to the Russians on. We hear that quite a bit, but even with that, their tourism from Arab countries has gone up dramatically, and so they're adaptive in that way. I want if I can go back for just a minute to the Wendy Sherman thing. I want to mention that I understand there's another visit in the works that's actually happening, I think, this week. And if I'm not mistaken, it's an official from US-UN who's going out to talk cross-border issues. Now, this is tied to my other portfolio that I was working in Syria. And I think one of the things probably that Wendy Sherman talked about that will be followed up by this next visit is this cross-border issue. And by that, I mean that there were five up until last summer, border crossings into non-regime held territories that the UN and World Food Program and others associated with UN could use. Now, when those are not approved, and they have to be approved every 6 months, then the UN cannot use them. Now, Turkey can use any number of crossings, Bab al-Salam, Bab al-Hawa, and others, because it's for their own bilateral stuff to the Syrian opposition or Syrian communities, they can do it. But the bulk of the aid that comes from multilateral donors has to go through UN-approved crossings. And last summer, the Russians closed off 4 out of 5 of these across border, including one called Yarubiya, which is out on the Iraqi border. Now there's Bab al-Hawa that's still operating, and the Russians probably are going to try to close that down this summer because they want all of the aid cross border to come. Well, they want it to come from Damascus. So they want to empower the Damascus regime by having the UN send all aid through them, which would give them incredible leverage. So the US and Turkey have a very sharp shared interest on this. And I suppose that some of the visits going on are, especially if we've got a US UN or other officials going out to talk about that, is trying to develop this shared interest that we have. And I think if there was a positive point as opposed to a cautionary point from the visit, that was probably it. And to tie that together with this week's visit, I think these are 2 important signs in the lead up to is it June 14th that we're supposed to have an Erdogan Biden meeting on which, again, I don't expect to solve a whole bunch of the bigger issues, the structural issues, but it's a good sign that the Turks at least want some positive, and the Americans want some positive momentum heading into that.
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely. And I think one of the important things to note is that you know, in the news reporting on Wendy Sherman's visit, it is mentioned that she had a great amount of praise to offer to the Turkish government for the way it has dealt with the millions of refugees that have come in from Syria into Turkey. And I think that was a way of teeing up, you know, there is an area where we can work together, where there is really no, I mean, it's when you put it into terms of humanitarian assistance to people who are in great distress, and you can push aside the politics. So I think it is an area where, you know, I think Wendy Sherman was trying to get some good vibes out there, and I think she did, and that tees up the visit from US UN. So yeah, there's a hopeful sign. The June meeting, you know, should be interesting. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's going to be about solving things. I think it's going to be about one, letting Erdogan understand that Joe Biden does not deal with foreign leaders the way Donald Trump did. Donald Trump was interested in personal relationships. It wasn't a personal relationship. He didn't get along with people. Joe Biden is a creature of the US foreign policy community going back, what, 40 years? I mean, how many years was he a Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman or the ranking member? So that's something that, you know, this is why the lack of a phone call to me was disappointing, because Erdogan's not going to understand that until he actually deals directly with Biden. Until that information comes to him directly, that Biden is kind of a more institutional foreign policy guy rather than a personalized foreign policy guy, there's going to be plenty of room for misunderstanding. So hopefully June will eliminate some of the misunderstanding about, you know, what is the nature of the person Erdogan is dealing with when he's dealing with Biden.
Yeah, I think in any case that there are outer limits. People sometimes get a little hyperventilated talking about Turkey because they're like, oh my goodness, you know, we should kick them out of NATO, or that they're turning into something horrible. It's a rogue regime. You know, look, we're NATO allies, and that provides some structural breaks on how far the difficulties can go. I was noticing this morning about the major NATO exercise that we had in the Balkans, including deployment of the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, Turkish-led, currently into Romania for operations. And this has made the Russians somewhat uncomfortable, which is sort of what it's designed to do. And guess what? If you want to have NATO response force deterrence in the Black Sea region and in Eastern Europe to protect the eastern flank of NATO, you cannot do that without Turkey. Right. And that's not just because of Turkish geography. That's because of Turkey's very real and very potent military capacities. So people who talk about, like the outer limits of this being not something we can slow down or break or mitigate the frictions. And you know who I'm talking about. There's people in Washington who write such things and try to paint them as a rogue regime, or this is just craziness. I mean, at the end of the day, they are an indispensable ally, and they bump up against the irreducible fact that they are dependent upon our goodwill economically. They do. And they respond to that, and their people know it. And that's why they have to, dot their I's and cross their T's on certain things when we really, really care. And at the same time, we have a dependence on them for security and stability in a big swath of Eurasia because of their presence and because of their capabilities. We are mutually dependent. And what that means is that we are going to work through the difficulties. They're not an easy ally. They never have been. And I'm not saying we should give them a free pass because of that mutual dependence. But I think so far the signs are that the administration is working to maintain a balance of sorts with some sticks and some carrots appropriate to that.
Yeah, and I'll return to one thing. I mean, I had some far too limited experience working with David Satterfield when I was posted to Iraq, and he was a number of times serving essentially as the acting ambassador during the absences of Ryan Crocker. I mean, he's one of the very best that we have. He's a consummate professional. He's very bright, and I hope that the people inside the Biden administration, whether it's Blinken's people over at State or whether it's other people at the White House, that they understand this guy needs to stay in place. He's highly regarded by his Turkish counterparts in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I mean, the people he has to work with. So, and to me, it's a very good sign that he hasn't, as a career diplomat, he hasn't been pushed aside for, somebody from the electoral campaign of Joe Biden. You know how this game works, and yet this is a key ally. Again, it's in the G20. It's one of the 20 largest economies in the world. We're not going to be able to move the country from where it is, and it's in a geostrategic place. So, and again, keep the professional in there. The other thing that returns a little bit to my point about, we're out of the personalized diplomacy of the Trump years. And then let's be honest, it was personalized to a large degree. We're back towards the more institutional diplomacy. One way to send that message loud and clear to people is to take those career foreign service people who are chiefs of mission and leave them in place. Don't just willy-nilly pop them out because they happen to be serving as an ambassador when Trump was president of the United States. I mean, there's been far too much personal bias, far too much action by the Biden administration to just knee-jerk react against something because Trump was for it or for something because Trump was against it. That's not a good way to run policy. I don't see it as much in foreign policy as in domestic policy, so that's good. And I really hope that somebody like David Satterfield continues in that position because I think he's incredibly valuable to us.
Yeah. And to be a little glib about it, it may be the case that the people who want to be rewarded for campaign service want to go to countries a little bit less thorny in the bilateral relation than Turkey.
So before we close, since you mentioned Romania, which was one of my postings, I had to tell my Romanian friends, okay, that the Turks were visiting this rapid reaction force, special reaction force, but they weren't there to reestablish the control of the Ottomans. Relax, guys. But there was an ambassador to Romania from the United States. His name was Jim Rosapepe. He's kind of famous. You can You can look up the IG report on him, which is entertaining reading. And we always joke that he had worked very hard on the Clinton and Clinton Gore campaign to get Bill Clinton elected in '96. And we always joke that what happened was the White House called him up and said, "Hey, Jim, how would you like to be the ambassador to Rome?" He thought he was going back to Rome, where he had been born, as the son of two journalists, American journalists. So we all think that he thought he was going back to Rome. But I think I take your point. Actually, it's kind of sad because it would just absolutely be challenging. It's a challenging relationship with Turkey. And yeah, being in Ankara is not as, I don't know what it would.
Placid.
Let's face it, Istanbul is one of the greatest cities in the world. Ankara is not. Okay, fine. But still, there are not many postings of more importance to U.S. I mean, okay, fine. You get to go to what? You get to go to Belgium as the bilateral?
Well, Rome sounds good. Ireland, I think. I've heard that a lot of them like to go to Ireland or Scandinavia. But look, if it was me or you, I think we'd choose to go to Turkey. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I understand the Biden administration is not planning on calling either one of us anytime soon.
No, I think I burned my bridges with them, or at least some of the people who are over there in state. I burned those bridges quite some time ago. So yeah, but that's for another conversation. So anyway, thanks again. One thing I would like you to do is keep in mind coming back maybe in a month, as we're closing in on the 5th year anniversary of the attempted coup. And that is something I think worth talking about, kind of, how has Turkey moved on from what was, and we can talk about how few Americans really appreciate, look, January 6th was not a coup attempt. What happened in the United States at the Capitol. I mean, it's a terrible thing, all that, but most Americans don't understand, how traumatic July 15th was. Yeah. 2016. So
I look forward to a conversation with you about it.
Okay. Very good. Rich, thanks very much. Thanks again. Take care. For our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Anatolian Dispatch, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.